Well, welcome everyone to another episode of WA This Week. Again, another interesting week in Parliament. We did a big debate this week in Parliament, our matter of public interest, looking at the management of this government in terms of how they manage projects and transparency. And you know, it's an interesting reflection to look at that, because what we see is a government that is obsessive about secrecy, but also utterly incompetent in managing major projects. The Auditor General released her report this week, looking at 14 of the major projects the government are managing. And I won't go through it in detail, but you know, of those 14 projects, 7 of those are more than a year overdue. One is 2.5 years overdue, and they're around $560 million over budget on those projects. This is a government that cannot manage major projects. More importantly, cannot manage your money. Imagine what $560 million could do to help solve homelessness in this state. It could solve that problem forever. Instead, it's being wasted on incompetent management of projects. But one area I really do want to highlight, which I think is really disturbing in terms of a complete failure of government in managing your money properly, is the sale of 3 Landgate properties in Midland to a company that manages rental properties. Now, I don't have any concerns with the company that it was sold to. In fact, this company would be celebrating the deal of a lifetime, I think. And you know, you might say at one level, good luck to them, but unfortunately it's you, the taxpayer, that is going to pay, and not just pay today, but you're going to be paying for the next 15 years for what is a completely bungled deal. And I'll take you through a little bit of detail on that. This is land that's owned by the government in Midland. They own these properties. Now, the detail that we've been able to ascertain is that there's 13,700 square metres of rentable space in those buildings. Now, I've spoken to experts in this field, people that actually develop properties for rental and otherwise buy and sell those properties. They tell me that the minimum valuation for that property should be around $5,000 per square metre. And that would mean that that property should have sold for $68.5 million. What did the government sell it for? The government sold those properties for $17.3 million. So that's a substantial gap. Now, the government say, well, significant modifications are going to have to be done to the building. So if you look in the budget, the government had planned modifications of that building of $10.5 million. That gave, you might say, well, that building is valued at $27.8 million, you know, in terms of its total value. But it should have been sold for $68.5 million. I mean, the best spin the government can put on this is that they sold that building for $40 million less than it was worth. Imagine that, $40 million less than it was worth. Now, the government are going to continue to lease the building that the buildings that they once owned. So they're going to continue leasing them for the next 15 years. And the leases they're paying are absolutely top dollar, if you like, in terms of the cost of those leases. Now let's go through it. Let's imagine the government was right and those buildings were actually worth $27.8 million. Because they're a blue chip, long-term leaseholder, I'm told that the typical yield an investor would expect is around 5%. Now, 5% of, if we include the upgrades, 5% of $27.8 million is around $1.4 million per annum. How much rent do you reckon the government are paying? The government are actually going to pay about $5.7 million rent every year on that property. So a 5% yield would give you $1.4 million. They're going to pay $5.7 million year on year over the next 15 years. And of course, there'll be escalation built into that in any case. This is an absolute disgrace. Now, I asked Minister Saffioti in Parliament, who's the minister responsible, I asked her, can you please share the detail of the modelling that was done to justify this deal. The minister said in a press release that the government was going to save $12 million on this deal. Now, you know, it's quite clear that there are only two choices in relation to this deal. Either someone in government has monumentally mucked up. We've got a cabinet, none of them have any commercial experience, who didn't even look at it and go, hang on, we're selling it for 17.3, but we're going to pay $85 million in rent over the next 15 years. That doesn't sound like a very good deal. There was no one there who had the acumen to do that. So either it was a monumental muck-up, or either there's something fishy going on. Now, I don't know, and I believe, in fact, this is just gross incompetence on the part of a government. You know, they tout themselves as great financial managers. Cabinet must have approved this. Everyone that sat around that cabinet table, including the Premier, looked at this deal and thought, that's just fine. That's a good use of taxpayers' money. You know, that goes to highlight just how incompetent this government is. That's why we see these massive blowouts on their capital projects, because they cannot manage your money. Now, they've had good luck with massive windfalls in terms of additional GST revenue and additional mineral royalties, in particular iron ore royalties, but they're wasting that money, and they're really wasting a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I guess that example I've just given really goes to contrast with the cost of living distress that households in Western Australia are facing right now. All households are seeing massive increases in fees and charges, and really disappointingly, I think, the government had an opportunity to give you relief here. They've got a $5.7 billion surplus, courtesy of the GST and the mineral royalties. And instead of saying, you know, we know things are tough now, we're going to give you some relief, we saw massive increases, substantial increases in fees and charges in every sector where the government applies those charges, whether it was your car licence, your power, your water, and the like. You know, that's hurting households. Now, what do we see during this time? We've got the Premier, the Deputy Premier, heading off on a summer holiday. I mean, this is just, you know, incredible. And, you know, you'd have to think that the Premier tries to justify this, and he's saying he's flying over to Europe and he's doing these things to help Western Australia. But boy, the itinerary for their trip really looks like a summer holiday, you know, a boyhood dream. You know, when they left uni and they wanted to travel to Europe, all the places they wanted to go. You know, flying off to Italy, then, you know, to other parts of Europe. You know, this is not going to bring workers back to Western Australia. And it's not going to help our economy. It's an enormous amount of money to spend, and it seems to be a complete indulgence. And the Premier can paint it up any way he likes. And you know, the Deputy Premier, we've just had 2 weeks of Parliament. We have a period coming up that we call the winter break, where there's 5 weeks where members of Parliament can do other business, and often that's when they travel. The Deputy Premier didn't even bother staying in Western Australia for the last 2 weeks of Parliament. In fact, we had 2 days of that parliamentary sitting where we didn't have the Premier or the Deputy Premier in Parliament to be accountable, to answer questions. You know, they don't have to spend a lot of time there, but they're so arrogant they don't think they have to be there. But, you know, it's a real, I think, a real insult to Western Australians. You know, while you're suffering, while many, many Western Australians are making the most agonising decisions about how they're going to eke out their income, and interest rates rising, and the great fear that they're going to continue rising in the future, they're off, I think, enjoying themselves on a trip around Europe. I think that's appalling. And it just demonstrates again the arrogance of this government. They don't think they're accountable to you. They don't think they're accountable to the opposition. I'd encourage you, spend a bit of time, go and look at how the Premier and his ministers behave during question time in Parliament, because we treat that seriously and we treat it with respect. And they treat it with absolute contempt. They are offensive, abusive, and otherwise don't answer questions. And have a look. I'd encourage you, go and search it up. It's easy to find Hansard online, and just see how the people that are supposed to be responsible leading our state behave, and I think you'll be quite shocked. Another matter that came to our attention this week, the Honourable Nick Gran, who's a member for the South Metropolitan Region in the Upper House, asked a question of the Minister for Emergency Services, the Honourable Chris Dawson, whether he got to see the Chief Health Officer's advice in relation to extensions of the emergency period. We're in a declared state of emergency. I mean, you might not think it, you know, unless there are rockets raining down in your area, you might not think we're in a state of emergency at the moment, but officially Western Australia is in a state of emergency under the Emergency Management Act. It gives the government all sorts of powers, but the one that the government loves most is it means they never have to explain their decisions. Now, you'd think that the Minister responsible for that area, for emergency management, Minister Dawson, you'd think he'd be looking at the advice from the Chief Health Officer to make sure that that justifies the extension of the emergency. He'd be asking questions and he'd be interrogating that, because you don't have a state of emergency just as a normal course of events. It offers the potential to curtail all sorts of usual civil rights. And you only do it when there is an emergency. Sometimes you need it. We agreed at the start of the pandemic, when no one knew what was going to happen, that you needed it. But we don't need that now, and we've said that consistently now for a period of time. But imagine the minister who's responsible for that area doesn't even bother looking at the advice. I think it's appalling. You know, that's a lack of good government. That's a minister not doing their job. I think it puts a lie to the fact that we need to be in a state of emergency, that the minister doesn't even think he has to look to the advice. They just keep extending this emergency, this state of emergency is fundamentally wrong. It's a misuse of those powers and those provisions that are in our Constitution for what are genuine emergencies, and we're not in an emergency now. Look, thanks very much for listening. Really appreciate the folk that keep an eye on this, and again, hi to my DPC friends, hope you enjoy it as well. That's the Department of Premier and Cabinet, they've got a big team up there. Look, otherwise, if you want to get this as a podcast, you can get it on Stitcher or Spotify, or you can get it on whatever platform you get your podcasts on. And if you want to see the video or share the video, then you can look up Dr. David Honey on Facebook, and you can share that with your friends and get the message out. Sometimes, you know, some of these stories don't get around, but I think they're important. It's important information for the community to see how their government is behaving. Otherwise, please give us your feedback. We love the feedback, and you know, people are very generous with that, and that helps us improve what we do. Thank you very much.